I think now the discussion begins. So, Sai Deepak, what would you like to say and what would you like to ask Shashi?
Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah? Yeah, okay.
You're holding it, I think, helps.
Oh, okay. So, first of all, thank you, Dr. Krishna, for giving me an opportunity to share space with Dr. Tharoor, and congratulations on your book, sir. I've had the opportunity to go through it, at least the important portions of it. And as someone who typically doesn't use a pen to mark on a book, I was forced to do it this time because there are certain aspects that I came across. The one thing that I certainly agree with Dr. Krishna on is that for all practical purposes, my book is perhaps an inadvertent rebuttal of yours. And my book was released on August 13th. Last week was actually the Chennai release, so to speak. And the good thing that I've done, and this is not an attempt at self-edification, is that I have steered clear of all the Hindutva ideologues, so to speak, in building my case, which is that there is no reference to Savarkar whatsoever. There is no reference whatsoever to even Tagore or Gandhi or anybody else for that matter. And let me start with perhaps a factual correction. Kindly indulge me. Hindutva was not coined by Savarkar. Hindutva was coined by Chandranath Boshu in 1892 in his essay on Hindutva specifically. Long before Savarkar actually wrote on the subject, someone had already thought of it and had actually fleshed out its embodiment, so to speak, and Chandranath Boshu. Yes. So Hindutva, unfortunately or fortunately, is attributed to the mind of Savarkar when in fact it's not. So that's the first factual correction. Second, I wouldn't dare use the word criticism because I would be stepping into too large shoes. I wouldn't do that. But my own impression of your book is that perhaps it takes a truncated view of what people crudely dub as Hindu nationalism. I've addressed certain parts of that actually as part of my book. The idea is to place the current movement and the awakening of this particular society within the larger canvas of what global scholarship refers to as decoloniality, which is to basically say that post-colonial societies are trying to shed the baggage of post-colonialism and wear the lens of decoloniality to be able to re-access their past and not recreate their past, but to re-inscribe certain values of the past in the institutions of the present and hopefully chart a more indigenous future. But it's not possible to completely create an indigenous future simply because it happens to be an integrated world. And that's the reality that you have to deal with and actively engage with. So the idea is to create perhaps a hybrid future which has a greater quotient of indigeneity as opposed to coloniality. Let me say this with as much humility as I can marshal at this point, that perhaps your previous book on the British colonial period, as well as this book, completely missed the scholarship of decoloniality because unfortunately, Bharat's experience with colonialism is being approached with a blinkered vision, and I'm making a reference to a general school of thought, and I'm not making this personal at all. Because the idea that Hindu nationalism is fundamentally exclusionist and comes to the detriment of and at the peril of religious minorities in this country is to impose the guilt as well as the framework of European nationalism on Bharatiya consciousness. And every mistake and every folly and every massacre or every genocide which was perpetrated in the name of European nationalism is somehow consciously and unconsciously sought to be transposed onto Bharatiya reawakening. I do not wish to call it Hindutva, I do not wish to call it, any Twa, so to speak. I will simply call it Bharatiya Dharmic Civilizational Reawakening, which is what it translates to. The problem is, unfortunately, whenever this discussion starts, we seem to be fixated with certain personalities, which is Savarkar, so on and so forth. I am happy to completely discard Savarkar, and I'm sure this is going to get me a lot of hate mail, completely discard Savarkar to build a case for Hindu civilizationalism or Dharmic civilizationalism because it is possible to do so. And the concept of Dharmic civilizationalism is much larger than any single individual. And to box it and lay it at the doors entirely of one particular person simply because he comes from an inconvenient political camp, so to speak, or espouses a certain cause that may not be politically correct, would be to do grave injustice to the society using one particular individual as the strawman of the argument. So therefore, it is my position, and I say this with all humility, that with due respect to Sri Savarkar and his contributions, because I've seen the tone as well as the manner in which you refer to him, I'm absolutely sure that it's not possible for us to glorify all parts of any individual. You would agree with that. Be it Mahatma Gandhi, or at least I refer to him as Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. I choose not to refer to him as Mahatma Gandhi. Pardon me for saying so. Or for the matter, Dr. Ambedkar. I don't think there's a single individual, if you choose to start scrutinizing them, that you would find yourself agreeing with all parts of everything that they say. Be that as it may, you try and make do with those parts which you believe, define them, characterize them. Therefore, for all his flaws and whatever they may be, Savarkar was effectively putting forth a position which was already in public domain and he was capturing a certain spirit. But be that as it may, I don't wish to be the mouthpiece of Savarkar here. The point is, it is possible, and it must be so, that you look at this particular concept of dharmic civilizationalism independent of the lens of European nationalism. Unfortunately, the moment this discussion starts, I think people start cherry picking certain facts, which is that the constitution is fundamentally antithetical to, or is it loggerheads with, the Hindutva vision of a Hindu Rashtra, so to speak. So perhaps you may want to look at the draft constitution that was presented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which actually promised equal rights to religious minorities. And the reason why this is important for us to point out is because, assuming for a moment that we did not have the concept of contemporary constitutionalism emanating from Europe, even then, Bharat as a civilization has always welcomed those people who are willing to live with us. We did not have a constitution when persecuted Parsis knocked at the doors of Bharat. We did not have a constitution when, let's say, the Jews from your state, so to speak, and even from the northeast, knocked at the doors of Bharat. So to attribute certain large-heartedness entirely to the constitution, I would say, is to protect the constitution at the expense of the civilization, which I think is grave injustice.
I've never done that.
I'll just finish my point.
When you finish on that.
So as far as I am concerned, to assume that the constitution is somehow a civilizing tool which seeks to educate and civilize and, let's say, uplift a certain regressive society, which is at loggerheads with the value of constitutionalism, which doesn't know what is democracy, which doesn't know what it is to accommodate minorities, no. It is a product of the fundamental spirit of this particular land. And despite the horrors of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality and tragedy of partition, which we must never forget, despite the reality of the two-nation theory, which was specifically foisted on us, which we must never forget, I think this country has done a vastly superior job of protecting its minorities than our former, let's say, estranged cousins, so to speak. And I think the proof of that lies in the fact. So it actually is very, very surprising when we are constantly told that this particular country, if it becomes a Hindu Rashtra, or if it becomes a dharmic civilizational state, so to speak, is bound to become what you refer to in your book as the Hindu Pakistan. I'm sorry, I think that's grave injustice to the people of this country, because accommodation is something, an accommodation, not Western style assimilation. Accommodation has been the spirit of this country, because Western style assimilation requires you to convert to their way of life in one form or the other, either overtly or covertly, in order for you to be accepted as part of the particular society. It is this country that makes it possible for people to keep their culture alive in the most perhaps pristine form possible, so long as it does not come in the way of others. So I would actually make the case that dharmic civilizationalism is what is crudely dubbed as Hindu nationalism. And as a student of constitutional law, not to claim specific expertise or drop names here, I believe that whenever public morality has been referred to in the Constituent Assembly debates, the reference has been to the reservoir of this country's public morality drawn from the vast ocean of dharma. And as far as I understand, the concept of dharma is native to this particular land, so to speak, and its culture. And there is one clarification or correction that I think is very, very important, that it's possible to simply reduce the so-called Indic reawakening, so to speak, as identity politics. It's possible to muddle it to the level of identity politics. In my humble opinion, that would be perhaps the most superficial way of looking at it. Because scholarship, psychology, political science, as well as students of history strike a very clear distinction between identity and consciousness, which is to say you can be a Hindu in name and still think like a foreigner, because your language and your accent and everything could be something that is completely alien to this land. So according to me, identity is less important and consciousness is more important, which is why if I had to choose between an Aurangzeb and Dara Shikoh, I would choose a Dara Shikoh simply because in consciousness, he was closer to the Hindu spirit, notwithstanding his identity. But Aurangzeb, for all practical purposes, his consciousness and identity were one and the same, and completely antithetical to the nature of this land and its accommodative spirit. So that is the distinction. And the third point that I think needs to be made very, very clearly, because Savarkar's work, whether it is capable of being misinterpreted, misconstrued, or interpreted in the right manner, is not the touchstone of Indic Renaissance. Because it is the typical strawman, one of the strawmans that's created is to basically say, Hindutva is ethnocentric, it has a certain obsession with race, and therefore, in its rejection of religious minorities, it is merely presenting another form of xenophobia. The fact of the matter is, this land has accommodated several races, and not all of these races are necessarily native to what we understand as Bharat. They have come from several parts of the world, but have ultimately become part of this particular land, simply because their way of life has managed to find a way of coexisting with us, without actually having a fundamental principle which sees us as subhuman or dehuman. So anyone who is willing to let go of any particular tenet that has the effect of rendering me a second-class citizen or a second-class human being, forget citizen, is welcome in this particular country so long as he doesn't threaten to sever my roots to this particular land. So the idea which I'm trying to present is that Dharmic civilizational reawakening is not a restatement or a sophisticated way of presenting xenophobia or ethnocentrism, because ethnocentrism and xenophobia are the legacies of European-style nationalism, not Bharatiyata, so to speak. We have to be understood in terms of our ontology, epistemology, and theology in that particular order, not in terms of anthropology. Anthropology is the obsession of the European Westerner, not of Bharatiyas. These clarifications are extremely important. I'll wait for his rebuttal and then I'll go to the next point.
Shall I? Well, in all fairness, I think you've said some very interesting things, some very provocative, but some that I don't disagree with. And what worries me is that you choose to criticize me on the basis of setting up a straw man and things I haven't said. I've written rather extensively on something. I think I first wrote about Dharma in the Great Indian Novel 40 years ago. And so it's not as if, 32 years ago. And so it's not as if these are not issues I've thought about. I have no difficulty with the notion of the Dharmic civilizational roots of our culture and of our country. But I would rather follow the Vivekananda view of what Hinduism is all about, as I have explained at some length in the book Why I'm a Hindu, rather than the view that has been encapsulated by Savarkar and his followers, including those who are today in power and who have put Savarkar's portrait in Parliament and hailed him as one of the great icons of Indian nationalism. And the reason is that Vivekananda is very clear. He was extremely proud of his Hinduism. But what was he proud of? He celebrated precisely the inclusiveness of the faith. He said, for example, in Chicago, in that famous series of addresses to the World Parliament of Religions in 1893, he said, I'm proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. It's a sentence I read in my teens and that stayed with me all my life, that I kept thinking about. And the more I thought about it, the more profound it struck me as being, because I went to school like most of us studying that tolerance was a good thing, that tolerance was something that you would, a tolerant king is a good king, and so on. You learned that in history class. But in fact, tolerance is a basically patronizing idea. It essentially says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will generously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's all that tolerance says. Whereas acceptance, if you like, the Vivekananda view, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And this, his description of what Hindu civilization and religion and dharma has taught him, is very much what it has taught me. And from that premise, then, I go to a very different conclusion from Sai Deepak's comments. I don't believe that a young Muslim boy being beaten up in the name of love jihad because he loves a Hindu girl is dharmic. I don't believe that a Dalit or three Dalits being whipped within an inch of their life with a belt because they were doing their job of skinning the carcass of a dead cow is dharmic. I don't believe that this poor young fellow, 2 days after his wedding in Bihar, being tied to a tree and essentially flogged to death while being demanded to chant Jai Shri Ram, I don't think that's dharmic. So when we talk in terms of inclusive dharmic civilization, then all I can say is that those forces that have been unleashed in our country, in the name of this political philosophy, whatever you call it and whenever it originated, they unfortunately do not represent the virtues of our dharmic civilization as I have learned them from Vivekananda and from many others. I mean, he wasn't alone, and there were many, many interesting exponents of the faith in contemporary times who built on the work of great thinkers and sayers and scholars. Vivekananda is in a direct line of descent from Adi Shankara. Others have been inspired by many others in the Bhakti movement and so on. So we can go into a detailed discussion, but that's another book. And if you're interested, please read my book, The Hindu Way. Or if you're interested in the politics of Hinduism versus Hindutva philosophically, then please read Why I'm a Hindu. But having said all of that, let me come back to this book, which is what I was here to talk to you about. This book does not, in fact, as Sai Deepak seemed to allege, imply that the Constitution is all that we are, or that our civilization has reached its apogee in the Constitution. It's a pretty fine Constitution, highly admired by constitutionalists around the world, but obviously it is the end product of an entire historical evolution. And in our case for millennia, I've forgotten in which book, but I have written that, whereas the Italian nationalist Massimo Tapparelli d'Azeglio in the 19th century, when Italy was created out of a mosaic of principalities and statelets, rather famously said, we have created Italy, now all we need to do is create Italians. And I wrote that we never had an equivalent of such a thought in India's nationalism, because Nehru and all the others around them, if asked, would have said, India as a civilization, as an entity, as a land, as an idea, has always existed. We are merely giving contemporary expression to the longings of Indians. So there's never any need to create Indians. Indians existed. And in fact, in talking about it, I have argued in many of my writings, and it may even be in this book, that this is not particularly a Hindu idea, though I have great reverence for Adharma, because in fact, whereas as scholars like Diana Eck and so on have said that the the territorial configuration of India was essentially sanctified by the endless tracts of pilgrimage from one Hindu shrine to another over literally centuries or even thousands of years, and that's perfectly fine. It's also true that the rest of the world saw us as one, and that, as Maulana Azad pointed out, an Indian Muslim going on the Hajj would be greeted by Arabs, whether he was a Tamil Muslim or a Pathan from the northwest, be greeted as a Hindi, because there was this notion of India or Hind as one coherent civilizational space. So my argument is that it is very, very much something that we can converge upon. Where I'm parting from what I've just heard is in my insistence that recognizing these civilizational values in legal constitutional form by ensuring the equality of all is indeed fundamental to civic nationalism and is explicitly disavowed by many of the votaries of the kinds of doctrines that Sai Deepak is saying. Now, I must admit that since, like most others, I have also believed that the term Hindutva came with Savarkar's book, The Essentials of Hindutva in 1922, and I'm very happy to discover it's not the case. I have to admit that nobody today espousing Hindutva doctrine has put up any monuments to Chandranath Boshu, whereas Savarkar is very much hailed and recited and presented as the fount of those ideas. And the worry about, of course, Savarkar writing is that he was writing very much at a time when very similar ideas were flourishing in Europe, particularly Italy, Germany, and Portugal and Spain at that time, were caught up in very similar notions of ethnic nationalism. And it was no accident that Savarkar described Hindus as a race. He did not use the word religion, he used race because he was writing at a period when these ideas of racial purity were sweeping across Europe at the same time. So that, to my mind, discredited much of the origins of his ideas. But now that Sai Deepak tells me there's somebody else who has had a different understanding of Hindutva in the 1890s, I would be very happy to read him. If, on the other hand, if he has echoed a sort of Hindu-ness, a Hindutva, that speaks to the kind of Hinduism that Swami Vivekananda celebrated, then I have no quarrel with him, whereas I do have a strong quarrel with Savarkar as judged by his writings as well as by the content of his later political life. I think I'll leave the key disagreement to that, because I think that's where Sai Deepak has anchored his arguments, but I see he has taken some notes, so I look forward to hearing his counter thrust and to responding to it.
So, in the interest of time, am I audible? Yes. In the interest of time, I will stick to specific points made by Dr. Tharoor. First is that he believes that the Hindutva that he subscribes to, or the Hinduness that he subscribes to, is that of Swami Vivekananda. I'm actually happy you said that. Because while Swami Vivekananda was happy to speak of universalism and universal brotherhood from the podium of the Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he was very, very clear that universalism cannot come at the expense of pixelation of history, and certainly specific disagreements, theological disagreements, which resulted in constant practice of exactly this value called toleration, this civilizing, condescending virtue called toleration, which was resulting in the proselytization of Indians en masse. So much so that at least in two of his works, I'm sure you're aware of it, sir, where he specifically refers to his encounter with a Christian missionary on a ship either back to or from India, where a Christian missionary was constantly spewing venom against the religion of Satan, which is Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda, despite his belief in universal brotherhood, was forced to catch the Christian missionary by the scruff of his collar and threaten him with throwing him overboard. If I may say so, that according to me is Hindutva or Hindu resistance in action, which is to say, I'm more than happy to accommodate all your points of view, provided you first stop spewing venom against me in the name of your scripture. So the very same Swami Vivekananda, I'm so happy that you've actually cited him, also went on to identify in, let's say, book after book after book, in fact in several tomes, the history of invasions from the 8th century, at least until the 16th century. And this is something that he has never pixelated. So the great thing about these stalwarts of civilizational icons is that they were very clear that there is no inconsistency between recognition of the universal character of dharma and what dharmic communities and civilizations have been subjected to in the name of vidharma. Let's not call it adharma, let's call it vidharma. This is something that is starkly missing, and that's exactly what I've pointed in my book, which is to say that there is a filter called coloniality or colonial consciousness, which actively prevents this particular country, and specifically the majority of this country, from accessing specific aspects of its past and putting it in deep slumber in the name of secularism, because just as you have a problem with, let's say, the concept of tolerance, so to speak, European history, and I'm absolutely sure you're aware of this, is specifically clear about the Christian origins and Christian nature of secularism itself. Such being the case, I think when this particular community stands up and says, I've had enough of secularism, and I've had enough of this inclusivity that is specifically telling me forget everything. You keep citing Dalits, you keep citing everybody else, but you don't wish to talk about the treatment of Kashmiri Hindus and the specific causes behind it. You don't wish to talk about what exactly has happened in Bengal immediately after elections from the 2nd of May. You don't wish to talk about, let's say, certain pockets being created in Assam in the name of religion, dare I say. You don't wish to talk about what is, according to me, the longest running insurgency in this country, which is the creation of a crown colony in the northeast, and therefore there is Nagalim for something. Please Google up what they specifically are fighting for. It's Nagalim for, and the religious figure is specifically mentioned. With all these insurgencies going on, surprisingly, it is the Hindu who is the constant subject of scrutiny, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny on the rod. So therefore the point is, the Hindu has proved herself, not himself, herself, because Sabrimala, herself, to be more than open to reform in every possible way, because way before untouchability was abolished under Article 17 of the Constitution, the temple entry movement was initiated by the Maharaja of Travancore in 1936. That was already done. So several people, inward-looking people, were more than happy, if at all the Dharma Shastras warranted it, they were more than happy to say, we have to move on. So therefore, I'm merely saying that this particular community perhaps doesn't get the credit that it deserves, and it gets, let's say, more scrutiny than it deserves, whereas everybody else is spared scrutiny. That's point number one. Point number two, any concept must be understood, as Dr. Tharoor rightly points out, in historical context. I completely understand. But it should not be divorced from the unique cultural experience and historical experience of any community. So nationalism, when spouted by a European who is fundamentally a colonizer, is not the same as nationalism from Savarkar or anybody else who is the victim of colonization at the end of the day, who has witnessed two successive waves of colonization running for at least 1400 years. So to say that when we speak of nationalism, it's the same as European supremacism, I'm sorry to say, is to compare apples with oranges, where you're divorcing the entire history and focusing exclusively on the statement. Here, when we speak of nationalism, it is merely a call for throwing off the yoke of colonialism of two kinds. Therefore, this should not be compared with Europeans for the simple reason that you're comparing the victim with the oppressor and the aggressor. That, according to me, there couldn't have been a greater insult to a victimized and a colonized community. That's point number two. And I'll just make one more point, which is Constitution. Of course, it's a fine document, it's a great document, it must be worshipped. Yes, I get all of that. But the point is, Dr. Ambedkar, after having crafted this Constitution, during the Nehruvian dispensation, rues the fact that he actually created this Constitution because he was seeing it distorted under the Nehruvian dispensation, and he says very clearly that I regret the day that I was given this particular task of having to draft this particular document, because now I realize that a terrible piece of document can be used for the betterment of the people in the hands of good people, but a fantastic piece of document, a legal document, can be completely misused in the hands of scoundrels. I'm not even paraphrasing, I'm using his words exactly. So therefore, the fact of the matter is, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution regretted having to live during his lifetime to see the Constitution and its values being completely thrown to the winds. That's point number three. And the last point that I think is extremely important is the reference to Diana Eck, her book called India's Sacred Geography. Surprisingly, when she refers to India's sacred geography, she chooses not to refer to it as Bharat. She still focuses on India, which is exactly why I decided to call my book India That Is Bharat, because Article 1 speaks of India that is Bharat. Unfortunately, Bharat has been effectively relegated to the margins, whereas India is currently surviving at the expense of Bharat. The problem is, if you look at the introduction of Diana Eck's book, because I've had the specific opportunity to deal with it in my book, she recognizes the fact that as far as this country is concerned, it was created as a consequence of a network of pilgrimage centers. And therefore, there's a triple matrix of nature, culture, faith, epistemology, and patriotism coming together to create this entity called Bharat. But there again, she says, but Hindu nationalism, no. So the problem is, it's surprising that she regurgitates the very same scholarship of Radhakumar Mukherjee of 1914. She comes out with the very same scholarship on sacred geography of Jadunath Sarkar, of R.C. Majumdar. But we are more than happy to cite a foreign scholar by the name Diana Eck as opposed to Radhakumar Mukherjee, Jadunath Sarkar, or R.C. Majumdar, which, according to me, is proof of coloniality or colonial consciousness, so to speak, that we still seek the validation of someone sitting in Harvard. So it has to be someone of Indian origin educated abroad, or it has to be preferably a Westerner who's educated abroad, all of them telling us, of course you're great, you have our validation, you have our blessings. So that's exactly why I said perhaps we should have, let's say, a face-off as far as India That Is